Here are a few application questions dealing with functions. So we have done some application questions dealing with equations before. You'll find that this is not much different. On this one, however, they're going to ask us some questions about independent and dependent variables. So we've got a cost function here. C of x means the cost based on the x value. So the cost is $1,500 plus 35x. So this is the function that they gave us, which represents the daily cost for a local film company to produce X DVDs. So it's a daily cost for X DVDs. So the dependent and independent variables, the independent variable is always going to be our X value or our input value. So in this question, they tell us that X represents the number of DVDs. So independent variable, which of course would be X, would be the number of DVDs. Independent is always X because the Y value or the C of X value is going to depend on how many DVDs we produce. The dependent variable then will be whatever C of X represents, which is the daily cost for a film company. So the daily cost. So the independent variable is the number of DVDs. The dependent variable, meaning the daily cost depends on the number of DVDs. The domain and range of the function. So we've talked about domain and range, but now this is a story problem, so things are a bit more complicated. So if I just looked at the function and said, what's the domain? I would say, well, I could plug in anything I wanted for X. But remember that this is not just any old function. We're talking about the number of DVDs this company produces. So for the domain, it wouldn't make sense for the domain to be a negative value. We could, oops, I didn't mean to do that. My domain would be from 0, because I could produce 0 DVDs, or I could produce as many as my little factory could, kick out. So from 0 to infinity would be my domain. So starting at 0, because having negative DVDs doesn't make sense in the context of the question. The range will always depend on what you say for your domain. So for my domain, my lowest value is 0. So I'm going to find what is C of 0. C of 0 would be 1,500 plus 35 times 0. 35 times 0 is 0, so really it's just 1,500, which means if I produced 0 DVDs, the cost is still 1,500 just for rental of the space and electricity, etc., etc. So the range is 1,500, and then that value will continue to get bigger based on how many DVDs I produce. The last one, C of 200, they want me to replace X with 200 and evaluate. So 35 times 200, whoops, not 2,000, just pretend it's 200. 35 times 200 is 7,000. Whoop, losing it here. So I've got 1,500 plus 7,000, which gives me 8,500. Provide a verbal explanation of the meaning. That means the cost of 200 DVDs, or the production cost of 200 DVDs, is $8,500. Here's one for you to try, very similar to the last. Give it a shot, then press play to see how you did. This is a function that represents the setup and printing cost of a t-shirt printer. So they didn't say of producing X number of t-shirts, but it's sort of implied here that the independent variable X would be the number of t-shirts. Because that would make sense that the cost would continue to increase based on the number of t-shirts that you produced. The dependent variable would be the cost, or total cost, because as the X value increases, my total cost will also increase. We're going to find domain and range the same way we did for the last question. Think about what makes sense in terms of this question. Can I produce a negative amount of t-shirts? No, I can't. So my domain is going to be all of the numbers from 0 to infinity. So 0 t-shirts up to infinity. And we could be more specific and say, well, X obviously has to be a whole number because you can't produce, a half of a t-shirt. But we'll just stick with this for now to be a little bit more vague. The range would be based on the domain that I gave you. And so the range would be me finding what f of 0 is, which is 35 plus 4.5 times 0, which is just 35, meaning my very lowest cost would be $35 up to whatever, depending on how many t-shirts I end up producing. The last question asks me to find f of 100, which means rewrite my equation and replace any x with 100, then simplify. For this one, I would get 35 plus 450, because I would move that decimal 2 places. 35 plus 450 is 485. What does that mean? The cost of 100 t-shirts is $485.